My life as a young psychiatrist was filled with the tangible, the explainable. I dealt with minds, with emotions, with the very real struggles of human existence, all grounded firmly in what I could see and measure. But one ordinary afternoon, in a sterile hospital corridor, something happened that utterly defied every logical principle I knew. I found myself floating, not just figuratively, but literally above the ground, an experience that shattered my perception of reality and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about life, death, and consciousness itself. How do you reconcile a world built on solid ground with one where you simply drift?
Welcome back. Today we're diving into the extraordinary experience of a young psychiatrist, a logical mind that encountered something truly inexplicable. If you're drawn to these stories, please subscribe and like this video. Our question for today: have you ever questioned reality due to an inexplicable event? Share your story in the comments. Now let's get into this mind-bending tale.
Before all of this, my days were meticulously structured. A predictable rhythm of appointments, diagnoses, and the quiet satisfaction of helping others navigate their own complex inner worlds. Before that day, my life was a carefully constructed edifice of reason and empirical understanding. I was a young psychiatrist, just beginning my second year of practice, brimming with the idealism and academic rigor instilled in me by institutions like Yale Divinity School, though my professional path had diverged into the realm of mental health. My world was the bustling, often chaotic urban landscape where I lived and worked. My days were meticulously structured, a predictable rhythm of appointments, diagnoses, and the quiet satisfaction of helping others navigate their own complex inner worlds. I believed in the power of the mind, the efficacy of therapy, and the tangible realities of biological and psychological processes. My routine was comforting in its predictability. Early mornings with a strong cup of coffee, the methodical review of patient charts, and then the steady stream of faces, each with their unique story of joy, sorrow, or struggle. I lived in a cozy apartment filled with books on psychology, philosophy, and theology, remnants of my diverse academic pursuits. My evenings were often spent poring over medical journals, engaging in spirited discussions with colleagues, or finding solace in long walks through the city parks, where the vibrant hum of urban life provided a strange kind of calm. Growing up, I was always a curious and introspective child. I remember spending hours in my grandmother's garden, a kaleidoscope of colors and scents, fascinated by the intricate dance of life and decay. One particular memory stands out: finding a bird with a broken wing, the overwhelming surge of helplessness, followed by a fierce determination to save it, imprinted upon me a deep empathy for suffering. Conversely, I also recall the almost clinical detachment with which I approached difficult concepts, dissecting them, trying to understand their underlying mechanics. This blend of compassion and analytical rigor defined much of my early life and ultimately led me to psychiatry. I found immense satisfaction in the intellectual challenge of unraveling the human psyche and in the profound privilege of bearing witness to people's vulnerabilities and resilience. Emotionally, I would describe myself as grounded, perhaps even a little detached at times, in a professional sense. I experienced the full spectrum of human emotions, of course. Moments of genuine elation when a patient made a breakthrough, quiet despair when faced with intractable suffering, and the steady hum of everyday contentment. But there was also an underlying sense of searching, a subtle restlessness that whispered beneath the surface of my well-ordered life. Despite my academic background in divinity, my personal relationship with faith had evolved into something more amorphous, a belief in a commonality of being, a connection to creation rather than strict dogma. I found spiritual resonance in nature, in the quiet wisdom of ancient texts, and in the shared humanity I encountered daily. When it came to life and death, my views were largely shaped by my professional training. Death was the ultimate cessation, the end of consciousness as we knew it, a biological inevitability. I respected it as a natural process, but I saw it primarily through a medical lens, a failure of the body, a moment of profound grief for those left behind. The concept of an afterlife, while academically interesting and culturally significant, was not something I personally grappled with deeply. I was a pragmatist, a scientist at heart, more concerned with the tangible present than the unknowable beyond. My focus was on prolonging life, alleviating suffering, and helping individuals find meaning within their finite existence. I believed that what truly mattered was how we lived, how we connected with others, and the legacy we left in the world. I was certainly aware of near-death experiences. I had even read Dr. Raman Moody's seminal work, but I viewed them as fascinating psychological phenomena, perhaps a coping mechanism of the dying brain rather than literal journeys beyond the veil. I was open-minded enough to consider their implications, but my scientific conditioning kept a firm rein on outright belief. Little did I know, my meticulously constructed reality was about to be profoundly, irrevocably, and beautifully dismantled. As I opened the door of his hospital room, the unmistakable harbinger of impending death invaded my being. I saw an agitated, terrified, middle-aged man in the bed. The day began like any other, bathed in the soft, diffused light of a typical urban morning. The gentle hum of the city was already rising, a familiar symphony of distant traffic and waking life. I remember the comforting weight of my favorite ceramic mug in my hands, steam curling around my face as I sipped my coffee, the scent of roasted beans mingling with the faint, comforting smell of old paper from the books scattered around my living room. My morning routine was a ritual of quiet preparation, a quick review of the day's appointments, a mental check of my patient list, and a moment of mindful breathing before stepping out into the world. It was 1982, and the world, for me, felt predictable, structured, and firmly within the bounds of what I understood. My first few patients were a routine, their narratives unfolding with the familiar rhythm of anxieties, hopes, and minor breakthroughs. The day was progressing smoothly, a testament to the order I strove to maintain in my professional life. My office, across the street from the main hospital, was a sanctuary of calm, a place where people felt safe to unburden their deepest thoughts. The subtle scent of lavender from a diffuser, the soft lighting, and the muted sounds from the street outside all contributed to an atmosphere of therapeutic quiet. Then came the call. A consult requested by an attending physician for a patient in the hospital described as imminently dying. This was not entirely out of the ordinary for a psychiatrist, as end-of-life care often involves psychological support. But there was a certain gravity in the doctor's voice, an unspoken urgency that pricked up my usual composure. This wasn't just a dying patient. It was a professor, an intellectual, someone accustomed to control and understanding, now facing the ultimate loss of both. As I walked across the street to the hospital, the air felt a little heavier, the usual urban bustle seeming to fade into a dull thrum. The antiseptic scent of the hospital, usually a familiar background note, seemed sharper, more potent, like a prelude to something profound. There were no dramatic flashes, no ominous signs in the sky, no sudden chills down my spine. Only a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet tightening in my chest, as if the world around me was holding its breath. It wasn't a premonition of personal danger, but rather an acute awareness of the immense gravity of the situation I was about to enter. It was the feeling one gets before stepping into a sacred space, or perhaps a void. I took the elevator up.
the ascent feeling slower than usual, each floor a silent passage closer to an unknown threshold. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed, casting a stark glow on the pale walls. Every step I took towards his room felt deliberate, a quiet march towards a confrontation with the very edge of human experience. I didn't feel dread, not exactly, but a deep sense of professional solemnity mixed with a profound curiosity about how one truly faces the end. This was a man at the apex of his career, a mind that had spent a lifetime dissecting complex theories, now ambushed by an illness that offered no answers, no treatment, only an inescapable conclusion. The door to his room loomed, an ordinary wooden panel, yet it felt like a portal. There was no specific sense of foreboding for myself, no thought that my own being was about to be fundamentally altered. My focus was entirely on the man inside, on the task at hand. I was a doctor, and my purpose was to offer what comfort I could to accompany someone on their most solitary journey. Yet, as my hand reached for the doorknob, a strange, almost imperceptible feeling washed over me, a sense of being on the precipice of something far grander and far more terrifying than mere professional duty. The air seemed to thicken, charged with an invisible energy, a silent anticipation. I pushed the door open.
I clearly left my body and existed outside it. I was floating in a rather surreal environment. There was no sound. I saw everything exactly as in reality, but it seemed inaccessible. As I gently pushed open the hospital room door, the world seemed to warp around me. It wasn't a sudden, jarring jolt, but a subtle, insidious shift. The air inside was heavy, thick, with the unmistakable metallic tang of degrading red blood cells, the harbinger of impending death. It invaded my senses, a visceral signal that something profound was unfolding. My gaze immediately fixed on the bed, where a middle-aged man, the college professor I was there to consult with, thrashed and bellowed. "Don't bother me, go away," he roared, his voice hoarse with a terrifying blend of rage and fear. "I don't want to see an effing psychiatrist, and don't send in any clergy either." He flailed, a desperate, almost animalistic protest against the inevitable. I stood quietly, just inside the threshold, taking in the scene. He was a man at the peak of his intellectual powers, rudely ambushed by a killer illness, stripped of his accustomed control. He had no time to process, no space to understand why him, or what lay beyond this moment. He was accustomed to dictating, to knowing, and now he was caught in a maelstrom of protest. When his outbursts subsided, I calmly explained that his attending physician had requested my presence, assuring him I would leave if he wished. In the absence of a direct order to depart, I moved around the foot of his bed, pulled a chair close, and sat down. We were enveloped by that intense, pervasive odor, two figures on opposite sides of an invisible line, him fighting the dying of the light, me simply there to bear witness. It was in this space, saturated with the raw energy of his struggle, that the unimaginable happened. There was no pain, no dramatic light, no rushing tunnel, no sense of falling. Instead, it was an incredibly subtle, almost gentle detachment. One moment, I was sitting in the chair, a physical presence, observing him. The next, I was not. I didn't feel myself leave my body. Rather, I simply became aware that my body no longer existed in the way that it had before. It was as if my consciousness, my very essence, had seamlessly detached, lifting effortlessly. My highest level of awareness wasn't a heightened state of euphoria or cosmic revelation, but rather a profound, crystal clear consciousness of all around me, but my body did not exist. It was an extraordinary sensation. I was still there, in the room, perceiving everything with an unnerving clarity, yet utterly devoid of physical sensation. There was no weight, no temperature, no pressure.
I didn't feel myself breathing or my heart beating. It was a liberation, a sudden, astonishing freedom from the confines of the flesh. The sensation was predominantly one of surprise, a quiet astonishment at this impossible reality. As this profound shift occurred, I found myself floating 3 to 4 feet off the ground. It wasn't a feeling of effort, but of effortless buoyancy. I observed myself, or rather, where my body should have been, still sitting in the chair beside the agitated professor. The scene before me remained exactly as it was. The sterile hospital room, the frantic man in the bed, the muted sounds of the hospital beyond the door. Though I perceived them as distant and slightly muffled as if filtered through an unseen veil, my vision, while exactly as in reality, felt strangely inaccessible, as if I was watching a film of my own experience entirely detached from its physical parameters. There was no sound of any kind that I could recall from my own experience, only the continued muted visual of the room. My thoughts, surprisingly, were faster than usual, not racing in a chaotic way, but rather rapidly processing this impossible new state of being. How am I seeing this? Why am I here, like this? These questions flickered through my non-existent mind, laced with an almost clinical curiosity rather than panic. There was a sense of profound relief or calmness that washed over me, a tranquility that contrasted sharply with the terror radiating from the professor on the bed. It was a peacefulness born of absolute freedom from physical limitations, from the mundane anxieties of earthly existence. From this elevated, disembodied vantage point, I began to drift. It wasn't a conscious decision to move, but rather an innate, effortless floating that carried me across the parking lot. The familiar asphalt, the cars, the hospital building itself, all were still precisely as they were in reality, yet now I was observing them from a surreal, elevated perspective. It felt like moving through water, or perhaps through pure air, without any friction or resistance. The world beneath me was vibrant, visible, but I was no longer a part of its physical fabric. It seemed inaccessible, a tableau I could witness, but not touch. This sensation of being outside of time began to settle in. Everything felt like it was happening at once, or perhaps that time itself had simply ceased to exist for me. The ordinary sequence of moments had dissolved into an eternal present. I continued to float up the 15 steps to the office building entrance, then crossed the lobby to the elevators. Each movement was fluid, graceful, utterly effortless. There was no sensation of climbing, no strain, just this sublime, buoyant drift. I remembered reaching out a non-existent hand to push the button for the elevator, a phantom gesture, yet the doors opened. Stepping inside, or rather, floating inside, the visual image and sensation of being 3 feet off the floor persisted. I could see the other passengers below me, their faces upturned, seemingly oblivious to my elevated presence. A fleeting wave of anxiety washed over me. How will I meet with patients while 3 feet off the ground? It was a strangely mundane thought for such an extraordinary circumstance, a testament to the lingering ties to my former reality. The idea that they might not perceive my elevation simply didn't occur to me in that moment of profound disorientation and reorientation. This realm I had entered was a clearly mystical or unearthly realm, not because it was filled with fantastical creatures or celestial vistas, but because its very nature defied the laws of my waking world. It was the ordinary seen through an extraordinary lens, a reality where consciousness was unbound, where spatial limitations simply dissolved. There were no beings in my experience, no voices, no brilliant light. My experience was solitary in that sense, a private journey into the nature of consciousness itself. Yet despite the absence of external entities, there was a profound feeling of harmony or unity with the world. It wasn't a mystical revelation of oneness in the grand spiritual sense, but a quiet, undeniable understanding that I was united or one with the world in a new, fundamental way. The boundaries of my individual self seemed less rigid, more permeable. I was still me, my consciousness intact, but I was also inextricably linked to the fabric of reality around me, a silent, observing participant. There was no panoramic life review, no visions of the past or future, no deep insights into the meaning of life or the existence of God. My experience was less about receiving information and more about being information. The profound understanding that dawned upon me was a silent, embodied knowing that consciousness can exist apart from the physical body. This wasn't an intellectual concept I'd read in a book. It was a lived, undeniable truth. My thoughts, though sped up, were not concerned with grand philosophical questions, but with the immediate, overwhelming reality of my disembodied state. It was a purely experiential revelation. The sensation of calmness intensified. The fear and agitation I had witnessed in the professor, the very emotions I had come to address, felt incredibly distant, almost irrelevant to this new state. I was simply present, observing, existing in a realm that was both utterly familiar in its visuals and utterly alien in its mode of being. The silence, too, was profound, not an absence of sound, but a quality of silence that permeated everything, allowing for a deeper immersion into this state of pure awareness. It felt like time had stretched, or perhaps evaporated entirely, leaving only the endless, still point of existence. My focus was entirely on this surreal state, this effortless movement through space without a body, without effort, without the limitations of earthly physics. Every moment was a silent affirmation of this radical new truth. I was conscious, I was aware, and I was no longer bound by the flesh. The world was still there, but I was free of its gravitational pull, suspended in a state of quiet, detached observation. As I opened the door to enter the waiting room, I suddenly descended to walking on the floor. The world snapped back into focus with an almost violent jolt. My consciousness, previously a buoyant, unfettered entity, had been floating effortlessly through the hospital corridors, into the parking lot, and all the way to my office building. I was still grappling with the surreal reality of my elevated state as I approached the door to my waiting room, my thoughts still fixated on the absurd question, how will I meet with patients while 3 feet off the ground? It was a moment suspended between two realities, an almost comical juxtaposition of profound otherworldliness and mundane professional obligation. Then, without warning, it happened. The world snapped back into focus with an almost violent jolt. There was no slow descent, no gentle re-entry. It was a sudden, visceral drop, a plummet from effortless buoyancy to the undeniable pull of gravity. My feet hit the floor, and the impact, though not physically painful, was deeply jarring to my system. It was like being slammed back into a heavy suit of armor after experiencing the boundless freedom of pure air. The sheer heaviness of my own body was shocking, an overwhelming sensation after existing without physical form. Every muscle, every joint, every nerve ending seemed to register its presence with a dull throb. In those first bewildering seconds, a wave of disorientation washed over me. The lightness, the clarity, the strange, otherworldly calm of being separated from my body vanished, replaced by the familiar, yet now deeply uncomfortable sensations of being fully embodied. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible experience I had just had with the undeniable reality of my feet on the hospital floor. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a profound bewilderment, a sense of utter disbelief at what had just transpired. Was that real? Did that just happen? The questions echoed in my mind, raw and insistent. My body felt alien, almost cumbersome. A dull ache began to settle in, a general sense of physical fatigue and a peculiar numbness, as if my nerves were still struggling to reconnect with the world they had momentarily abandoned. The vibrant, detached clarity of my vision from moments before was replaced by the familiar, slightly less crisp perception of everyday sight. The sounds of the office, the distant chatter of staff, the rustle of papers, the soft murmur of waiting patients surged back into my awareness, no longer muffled or distant, but sharp, insistent, almost overwhelming after the profound silence I had experienced. There was an immediate and overwhelming sense of loss, not a loss of something tangible, but the loss of that incredible, effortless state of being, the absolute calm, the feeling of unity with the world, the sheer freedom from physical limitations. It was gone, replaced by the mundane realities of my physical self and the demanding schedule that awaited me. A wave of disappointment, almost a profound sadness washed over me. I had glimpsed something extraordinary, something that shattered every preconceived notion I held about consciousness and existence, and now I was back, anchored to the very things I had momentarily transcended. I had patients waiting, a schedule to keep, and a professional facade to maintain. I instinctively straightened myself, trying to reestablish the sense of composure that was a hallmark of my profession. No one in the waiting room seemed to notice anything amiss. They saw Stephanie, the psychiatrist, walking through the door, perhaps a little pensive, but nothing more. The fact that they didn't perceive my previous elevated state was in itself another layer of this surreal experience. It highlighted the intensely personal, almost solitary nature of what I had just gone through. In the immediate aftermath, I didn't share my experience with anyone. How could I? Who would believe me? As a psychiatrist, I was trained to interpret such phenomena through a clinical lens. Derealization, depersonalization, dissociative states, but I knew with an undeniable certainty that this was none of those things. This was real. This was different. The experience was so utterly beyond the realm of ordinary explanation, so profoundly personal, that articulating it seemed impossible. I also worried about how it would affect my professional credibility. Would I be seen as unstable, experiencing a breakdown? The thought of dismissing it as a mere hallucination or a trick of the mind felt like a betrayal of the truth I had just lived. So I held it within me, a silent, internal earthquake. I continued with my appointments, listening to my patients, offering guidance and empathy, all while a seismic shift continued to reverberate through my own being. The conversation with the dying professor, the catalyst for this profound journey, felt distant, almost secondary to the impossible reality of my own brief departure. The contrast between his visible fear of death and my serene, disembodied experience was stark, a paradox I began to quietly unpack within the confines of my own mind. I returned to my usual routine, but the world, and my place in it, had irrevocably changed. The ground beneath my feet felt both solid and strangely permeable, a constant reminder of the brief, miraculous time I had spent floating above it. It validated my subjective experiences and impressions. I still review mystical accounts carefully, but I'm not affected by deniers who discount them out of hand. The world I returned to was the same, yet entirely, irrevocably different. That brief, impossible journey beyond my physical form, that moment of effortless floating and profound clarity, became the silent, beating heart of my life thereafter. It didn't manifest as a dramatic overhaul, no sudden change of profession or radical shift in my external circumstances. Instead, the transformation was quiet, internal, and pervasive, like a dye seeping through every fiber of my being. My priorities, once firmly rooted in professional ambition and the tangible metrics of success, subtly began to shift. The intense drive to excel, to accumulate knowledge and accolades, still existed, but it was now tempered by a profound understanding of the impermanence of all things physical. What truly mattered were the unseen connections, the subtle energies that bind us, and the quiet dignity of human experience. I found myself less consumed by the daily anxieties and trivialities that once occupied so much mental space. Petty grievances, professional rivalries, the endless pursuit of material possessions, they all seemed to fade into insignificance when weighed against the overwhelming truth that consciousness could exist independent of the body. I didn't stop valuing my work, but its meaning deepened. My interactions with patients took on a new resonance. I listened with a more profound empathy, no longer just interpreting their words, but sensing the deeper currents of their being, the silent struggles of their souls. My worldview, once largely empirical and scientifically grounded, expanded exponentially. The concept of death, once the ultimate cessation, became a doorway. It wasn't a terrifying void, but a transition, a shedding of the physical form to reveal a more fundamental aspect of existence. My Yale divinity background, which had previously led me to an appreciation of various faiths and a belief in a commonality of being, now found a lived validation. The idea that creation is the primary site of worship and divine human interface was no longer a philosophical concept, but an experiential truth. My experience, though not spiritual in the traditional sense of seeing beings or bright lights, was profoundly spiritual in its revelation of consciousness beyond the brain. It didn't give me answers about God or an afterlife in a structured sense, but it cemented the belief in the soul's undeniable existence, an awareness that we are more than just our physical bodies. I became convinced that there is a fundamental connection, a unity that underlies all of existence, even if I hadn't explicitly seen or felt it as an oneness with the universe during my brief detachment. It was the subtle, undeniable sense that the world, even in its ordinary appearance, held an immense inherent harmony. This deepened understanding didn't translate into a singular new mission, but rather a profound integration into my existing life. My passion for understanding the human condition, for helping others, found new depth. I continued my work, but with a quiet conviction that there was far more to reality than met the eye. While I didn't immediately broadcast my experience, it became an unspoken compass. Years later, after retirement, this inner knowing would guide me to the wilderness of the Montana mountains, where nature is the primary cathedral. Surrounded by trees and animals, I found a profound validation of that sense of universal connection. Interacting with the natural world, non-verbally, became a source of pleasure and a constant reminder that all of living creation is connected. Integrating such an anomalous experience into a conventional life wasn't without its challenges. The primary difficulty was the sheer inexpressibility of it. I was reduced to a point of consciousness, without a sentient body, floating 3 feet above the ground level. How do you articulate that without sounding delusional or unhinged? For many years, I kept the experience to myself, knowing that the medical and scientific communities which I was a part of would likely dismiss it as a psychological phenomenon, a trick of the brain under stress. There was no existential crisis in the sense of a loss of meaning. On the contrary, meaning was deepened. The challenge was in reconciling two seemingly incompatible realities, the physical, tangible world and the undeniable truth of my brief, ethereal existence outside of it. I learned to navigate the world with this secret knowledge, a quiet certainty that often felt isolating. I continued to review mystical accounts carefully, not because I needed proof, but because they resonated with my own lived truth. The deniers who discount them out of hand no longer affected me. Their skepticism was simply a lack of their own direct experience. My experience did not grant me psychic abilities or premonitions of the future. It did not give me specific knowledge about life's purpose or an afterlife. What it gave me, with an unshakable certainty, was the understanding that consciousness is not merely a product of the brain. It affirmed that there is a fundamental, undeniable aspect of our being that transcends the physical. This isn't a theory or a belief. It is a memory, as vivid and true today as it was in 1982. The entire 10-minute sequence is seared into my consciousness. It taught me that while we are tethered to our bodies, our true essence, our awareness, can exist independently. It showed me that even in the face of death, there is a profound calmness and an unexpected freedom. My message then is simple yet profound. Do not be afraid. The physical world is but one layer of reality. There is more to us and to existence than what meets the eye or can be measured by instruments. That brief, impossible float across a hospital parking lot was not an ending but an awakening. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, a silent, undeniable testament to the enduring, boundless nature of consciousness. Embrace the mystery, live with empathy, and know that even when the body falters, the essence of who you are continues. What if the very fabric of reality is far more expansive, far more miraculous than we could ever conceive, even in our wildest dreams?
Stephanie's account truly offers a unique perspective on consciousness and the very nature of reality. Her experience, grounded in a scientific mind, provides powerful validation for the profound possibilities beyond our ordinary perception. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking narratives. And for your final comment question, how might a greater understanding of consciousness, as shared by Stephanie, influence how we approach mental health or end-of-life care in the future? May God bless you and fill your days with peace, wonder, and the understanding that there is always more to discover in His vast and beautiful creation. Until next time, take care.